will be my pleasure. So, Dr. Andrea Love is an immunologist and microbiologist with over a decade of experience in basic sciences, translational medicine, and clinical research. Her work in academic research focuses on differential host pathogen interactions of infectious diseases, and I'd be lying if I told you what I knew what that meant. And she earned a doctorate of philosophy in microbiology and immunology from New York Medical College. She works at a biotech company that develops tools to advance biomedical research in vaccinology, virology, immunology, immunotherapy, cell and gene therapy, therapeutic protein production, and more. She's also the executive director of the American Lyme Disease Foundation and, if that's not enough, a columnist for Skeptical Inquirer. Andrea is a subject matter expert in infectious disease immunology and cancer immunology and autoimmunology, and is adept at translating complex scientific data and topics for the public and healthcare providers. She's a founder of Immunologic, which is a science and health education organization and newsletter geared towards addressing misinformation and misconceptions about scientific topics that are relevant to the general public. Andrea was the 2023 American Medical Writers Association McGovern Award recipient, and in her spare time, I don't know how she has any, she's a marathoner, an ultra marathoner, which I also don't know what that is, a yogi, a black belt in judo, and an amateur wildlife photographer. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I definitely have to shorten that bio and just cut out all that fluff.
Ultra marathoner, please. What is that?
Well, I mean, officially,
Mhm.
technically, it's just anything over marathon distance. So, I've only run a 50K. And so in the
Oh,
ultra marathon world, they don't consider it until it's a 50 miler, a 100 miler, or a 24-hour, whatever the case is. But yeah, no, I mean, it's running is a good mental outlet for me, particularly, especially with, everything that's been going on in the world. So,
and a yogi. So what do we mean by that
yeah, I
specifically?
mean, when I was in college, I took some philosophy classes about yoga and read the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and I've always been really interested in kind of, yogi practice, not in just like the westernized, you go to your cardio yoga class and you do all that. And I was always very interested in it as kind of a moral guidance and a set of like tenets to approach your life. And for me, meditation has always been a really big challenge because my brain is always going nonstop. And so it was almost like a personal challenge. And I started, practicing more of the philosophical angles of it when I was in grad school because that was a really, stressful time. And a lot of people in the US don't realize that it's, the physical postures and practices only like 4% of yoga. It really is more of a philosophy. And so, that's always been very fascinating to me, but I do also practice yoga. I just I struggle with the pseudoscience that creeps into kind of westernized yoga, which is tough for me in particular as a scientist.
Yeah, I actually had somebody contact me on my own science communication site, lambasting me and other skeptics for not going hard at, I think it was the United Nations, for declaring World Yoga Day. And he went all in on, it's all pseudoscience. This is teaching people to
Yeah.
believe nonsense. He was
Yeah.
very angry that we
It's
weren't
it's
fighting
really
it.
it's really tough because if you take yoga as, a moral kind of philosophy, spiritual guidance, etc., because there's a lot of overlap with, other sorts of spiritual philosophies as well. And you kind of ignore kind of what Westerners have done to yoga in terms of every yoga teacher here is now a wellness coach and they say that you shouldn't get vaccines. I mean, my stepsister's yoga teacher told her that she had to get tested for MTHFR when she had kids and she shouldn't vaccinate them and all this stuff. So if you take all that aside, yoga itself is not it's a philosophy. It's kind of a way to approach handling your thoughts and how you deal with your thoughts. And then there's a physical component that's the goal is to kind of use your body to quiet down your mind, which is very similar to a lot of other exercises, right? It's kind of what happens to me when I go for a long run. But the problem is that that is conflated with what people in the US perceive yoga to be, right? Because a lot of yoga instructors here, dabble in pseudoscience, they promote pseudoscience, they sell pseudoscience. A lot of the yoga studios are like, well, you're going to take this supplement, you're going to,
Yeah, they
get
probably
this
have like a
alkaline water.
reflexology partner,
Exactly.
right?
And
Stuff like
so,
that. Yeah.
and
Mm.
that's really what I struggle with, because I want to go to a yoga studio and I want to practice because it's really much easier to do that than just do the poses at home. But then I go in and they talk about all the, misinformation. And I'm like, oh, just like I have
That
to
must be
resist the
so
urge.
hard
It's
for you.
so difficult. Yeah. And
So
it's a
hard.
bit of a bummer, but we'll keep trying to, chip away at that.
So what do you think? Do you want to look at the poll results first before you launch into your
Yeah,
discussion?
let's take a look, because I
All
think,
right.
this is gonna make a lot of sense. So, all right. So, where do you get your healthcare
Hey,
information? I mean, I'm impressed. I got to say, this audience very impressive. I see 92% of respondents listen to their healthcare provider. That's awesome. And then 73% are looking at medical websites, and we see only a minority looking at podcasts and social media and things like that. So that's encouraging to me,
yeah,
because
yeah,
I
absolutely. And
would
there's clearly an
say
overlap, right? This wasn't a
yes.
one-on-one.
Oh,
So
for
yeah,
sure,
yeah,
for
yeah,
sure. I'm
Yeah.
assuming that
yeah,
people had selected multiple
yeah,
options,
yeah.
but if you look
Yes.
at certain demographics, those proportions are very shifted.
Mhm.
So that's good. Have you ever received health information or misinformation? All right. I mean, almost half haven't, which is encouraging because it also means that faith healers and spiritual leaders are kind of staying in their lane, which is good. And I think it's really difficult, um, because a lot of times they're giving you life guidance, they're giving you moral guidance. And so there's obvious overlaps there. And then it also seems like the majority of people are not taking them as their ground truth or reference for their health information. So this is good news. I mean, I think if we could get the general population to align with these poll results, we would be in a much better position than where we are right now.
Yay, audience.
Yeah, we have a pretty good, well-read, well-informed audience here at RfRx. I have noticed,
I'm
based on our
impressed. I'm
polls. So
impressed.
yeah,
All
we
right.
got
Well,
people here that like to learn.
I love it. So I'm going to show some slides, but I do want this to be kind of, dynamic. A lot of this is really just to kind of showcase a lot of these themes that I want to talk about. So we already kind of talked on my about me. Um, so I'll skip over that. But one of the things that I do want to underscore is that because I've seen the impact of science misinformation starting when I was an early student. I mean, even in high school, I started seeing this. I grew up in Eastern Connecticut. Lyme disease is endemic there. There's a lot of misinformation when it comes to Lyme disease, and it really creeps into the wellness landscape. And I always felt this sense of responsibility. And maybe that was also, I like to tell people about random facts. And I have recently learned a couple years ago that I have ADHD, so that perhaps is related. But even as a small child, I was obsessed with like creepy crawlies and things that spread disease, and I wanted to tell people about it. And so as I've grown as a scientist, I've also grown in kind of understanding the disparity between what we do on a day-to-day basis as scientists, what the public understands about what scientists do, and even what healthcare providers believe that they know or, purport to know about science. And so I've really taken an active role, particularly during the pandemic, and since, to try to combat a lot of the clickbait that people come across. And this doesn't stick within a single ideology. We see misinformation that crosses all of these different belief systems and demographics. And so I use a lot of different formats, video and written, and I'll speak at scientific conferences because you have to really meet people where they're getting their information from. And that's why it's useful to understand where people are listening. So the kind of central question that I'm always asking myself is, we have all these people who say they believe in science. They have the yard sign that science is real, but even those people are refusing to acknowledge scientific data on certain topics. And so you find this disparity, and it's true nearly for everyone. I think you could probably find scientists even who, struggle with resolving a strongly held belief with the body of evidence on a topic. And so in reality, we want to say we follow the data, but oftentimes the ability to follow the data is influenced by all these other things that are part of the human nature, right? Political beliefs, ideological beliefs, social constructs, and that often interferes with the ability to accept the evidence. And part of that has to do with the fact that only 28% of Americans have civic science literacy. And civic science literacy is the ability to actually take scientific information, understand it, and make an informed decision, a truly informed decision, not, the anti-vaccine rhetoric of informed consent and all that sort of stuff, but being able to understand the scientific topic in a way that you can actually make a decision about your day-to-day life that is factual. And this becomes more problematic because more than half of adults consider themselves interested in issues involving science. But again, if only 28% of Americans have civic science literacy, then you have people who are interested, but they don't actually understand what they're reading or what they're, encountering. And so that makes it even more problematic. It makes it even more rife for misinformation. And so one of the things that you see is this risk perception gap. And there's a lot of other themes that I'm going to talk about, but the risk perception gap is exploited when people have low science literacy. And the risk perception gap is this excessive worry about things that pose almost no risk to you on a day-to-day basis, and not being concerned enough with things that actually do pose a risk to you or have a much bigger impact. So we hear a lot of noise about singular food ingredients, singular food dyes, singular food additives, singular chemicals, singular vaccine ingredients, pesticide residues. And these things are all over social media, right? They're all toxic. They're all giving you cancer. They're all killing you. They're all filling your bodies with all of these, harmful substances. And nobody's talking about the things that we have decades of data to show that these things actually do impact your health, like your overall diet habit and whether or not you have a sedentary lifestyle, you're active, or taking participation in preventive health measures like routine screenings and vaccinations and well visits, and even just something as simple as checking your blood pressure regularly, or focusing on sleep quality, or limiting alcohol or avoiding tobacco, or the overarching impacts of climate change, right? Everyone is fixated on these singular kind of performative things because it's really easy to demonize one villain, then talk about these really complex topics that really require a lot of science literacy.
Well,
Right.
and that's a really interesting point too, because the things that you mentioned that we have so much data behind are not as exciting to have to
No.
find out, oh, I need to drink more water and sleep
Yeah.
more and be sure and
No.
exercise. And also, did you have slides you were intending to show?
Oh, yes. Do you not see them? Cool.
No.
Nope. Nope. Good job. Thank you. Let me.
We were both wondering, but we didn't want to interrupt.
Yeah, it was so
It was
interesting. I was like,
I
this
was
is,
I was going. I was
yeah.
going. All right, give me 1 second. And so, yeah, so basically, we're focusing too much on these tiny little things that are not actually impacting and you can see them now?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So,
Um,
so, so to read them, because this will become an audio version also, besides the YouTube
yes.
version. So,
Yes.
so, so there's a scale with worry too much about as opposed to
Yes.
not enough about, and the worry too much about. Do you want to read them, or I can do it?
Yeah, sure, that's fine. Yeah,
So,
so the risk
yeah, go ahead.
perception gap means that people are worrying too much about things that don't pose a risk, like singular food ingredients or singular chemicals, vaccine side effects or vaccine ingredients, or whether or not you're getting organic versus conventional foods. And we'll get into the pesticide conversation. And these things, they make waves because they're circulated on social media or media headlines, but they don't actually make a big impact on your day-to-day lives. We're not focusing on the things that do make the impact, the things that the big picture stuff, right? Your overall diet habit, whether or not you're an active or sedentary person. And there's socioeconomic things to talk about with regard to that, but whether you're participating in preventive health measures, what quality sleep you're getting, how good are you at alleviating your stress levels, how good are you at, addressing all of the things that play a role in these fundamentals. So limiting alcohol, avoiding tobacco, and then of course the big picture impacts of climate change, which is really broad and impacts things like food stability and, housing security and infectious diseases. But we never talk about those things because they're not sexy and they require like societal measures to actually address them. And it's much easier to kind of blame a singular thing or demonize a singular substance, especially when people don't have a great understanding of these fundamental science concepts.
I was just talking to a fundamentalist acquaintance, and we were at a club, and she's going around the club. Somehow climate change came up, and she was going all about, well, what's so bad? It'd be nicer if it's warmer. So they're not now saying it's not happening, but now it's just it'll be nicer.
Minimizing it. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's tough because when I want to talk about climate change from like the concept of or the perspective of infectious diseases, there's even within that, there's a lot of things you could talk about. You could talk about the expansion of disease causing vectors because as climates shift, you're going to have mosquitoes in places that maybe they weren't before and they're going to bring diseases with them. Or you could talk about the increased number of storms and standing water that serves as breeding ground for mosquitoes. Or you could talk about how natural disasters lead to housing insecurity and, unsanitary conditions that facilitate the spread of foodborne or waterborne disease. I mean, there's so many things you can talk about, and that's only one tiny arm of the climate change discussion. And so a lot of it comes down to the fact that it's really difficult to solve a really big problem like that has so many different factors, and single individuals don't really have the power to do much about that. And so it's a lot easier to try to focus on these things that you feel like you can control. But in the grand scheme of things, it's doing a bit of a disservice because those are the things that are really not going to do much in, the story of your health or your health outcome. But what we find is that we have ideologies are really what shapes people's belief in science or belief in evidence. And, each one of these kind of buckets of ideology, they're going to have different belief systems, even if they think in their mind that they believe the science or they're following the science, right? You can have people that have the yard sign that says science is real, yet they're terrified of food colorings, or they think that fluoride is toxic, or they only eat organic food because they've been convinced it's pesticide free. Or you can have your carnivore bros who just throw all of the evidence about the importance of fiber out the window because it makes them feel very masculine to eschew all of the nerdy information that says that you should have moderation and do those sorts of things. We have people that have religious or personal belief systems that, facilitate rejection of scientific principles or scientific evidence. When we talk about things like reproductive health or reproductive science, and of course, political ideology as well as your communities. So I want to kind of illustrate this because there's 5 different kind of demographics of people here, and there's 5 different things that kind of have this selective rejection of science, right? So you have your tech savvy libertarians, you have your educated and progressive liberals, affluent middle-aged white women, middle class conservative men, and white middle to upper class mothers. So if you kind of look at these and, think in your head which of these might match the other, you'll notice that there's often themes here. And so if we look at the tech savvy libertarians, these are people that often, they're super into tech when it comes to computers and, their cars and, satellites, but they reject biomedical advances like genetic engineering and gene therapy and new vaccine technology. Or you might have some educated and progressive liberals who, they are really in support of vaccines and they're really in support of novel cancer therapeutics. But when it comes to genetic tools in farming, they are convinced that GMOs and pesticides and chemicals are killing everybody. Affluent middle-aged white women, you have this you have this dichotomy where they don't trust the for-profit pharma industry because it's for profit, but they trust the unregulated wellness industry. I often call these the goop gals, right? And so there's this dissonance here where this selective trust is based on something that isn't actually true. Then you have your middle class conservative men, where generally speaking, they reject climate change and the impacts of climate change and the science behind climate change, whereas often they are in support of other scientific or industry advances, including with regard to things like farming technologies. And then your white middle to upper class mothers, you often have them in opposition for vaccines, but they will happily accept all sorts of other medical interventions. And often they're, screaming about toxins while getting a literal toxin injected into their face. And so you have this ideological barrier where this is exacerbated by a lot of factors in our current information landscape. And this is really why we see this escalation of misinformation and policymaking. And so, as I mentioned, right, we talked about the risk perception gap. A lot of this is driven by the media, the clickbait headlines, right? This toxic chemical is killing your brain cells. Well, if you actually look at it, they're doing a study in a petri dish. So they're pouring a chemical on some neurons growing on a piece of plastic. Well, that's not what's happening in a person, but the journalists either don't have the skill set or they don't want to kind of give the nuance. And so people are driven by emotion. So they see these headlines and they see something as toxic. Well, that shuts down all of their logic, right? They're going to then react with emotion. You have social media platforms, which is why I was so encouraged that most people on here are not getting their health information for social media, but this is a huge source of information and mostly misinformation, often by people with big platforms, but not actual qualifications. And we've gotten into this ecosystem where that number of followers is conflated with expertise. We have this really, really pervasive ecosystem of bad actors and profiteers, a lot of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, who on paper look like they care about health, but they're actually profiting by undermining scientific advances. Organizations like the Environmental Working Group and Greenpeace and Consumer Reports. And, it's really unfortunate because the people it's harming are the public who don't know any better. And then because of this scientific illiteracy, we have to remember that, this 28% of civic science literacy, that transfers to our politicians, right? To our elected leaders. And if they're not listening to credible scientists and they're listening to lobbyists who are bad actors and profiteers, well, then they're going to make policy and they're going to make decisions based on the person that's closest to their ear. And then of course you have these logical fallacies like the appeal to nature fallacy and chemophobia that exacerbate and they influence those decisions.
At the hearing to approve RFK Jr., I saw photographs where Vani Harry was right behind him.
Oh yeah.
So if
Yep.
people don't know, she calls herself the food babe.
Food babe.
And she's been quoted as saying, "Don't eat anything you can't pronounce the
Pronounce.
chemicals that are in it." It's unbelievable.
Yeah. Yeah, and this whole the bans on the food dyes, well, we'll get into that, but that's supported by people on both political ideologies, and that's really driven by a lot of this chemophobia and this low science literacy. So, we're going to talk about the appeal to nature fallacy because it crosses over into all the different arenas of science. So if we talk about in the context of farming, the appeal to nature fallacy, right? Everybody's heard organic is pesticide free, that organic is better, that conventional foods are dirty, they're covered in pesticides, and the EWG is one of the villains in my story. But they put out the Dirty Dozen list where they're like, well, these are the 12 most contaminated conventional produce items, and you should never eat them, and they're killing you, and they're full of toxic pesticides. And organic is marketed as being pesticide free and healthier and all of that, right? And this is because people are told that organic is all natural and conventionally grown produce and conventional farming is full of all this synthetic and toxic pesticides, right? Well, the problem with that is that misinformation about pesticides actually harms our country and our planet's natural resources. It also harms our farmers, and it also harms us, because when you talk about large scale farming, the reality is organic pesticides still exist. Conventional farms, for example, if we're talking about berry farming, conventional farms are going to use things like fungicides to control molds and other fungal pathogens, mildews that would grow on the berries or grow on the berry plants and would kill them and essentially ruin your crop, right? So this means that farmers are able to grow food for us, right? This is good. So using controlled fungicide applications allows farmers to produce food that more stably, more predictably with higher yields. If you compare an organic blueberry farm to a conventional blueberry farm, they have on average about 30% reduced yields because the methods they use to control pests are not as effective. And organic doesn't actually cost that much more for farmers. It only costs about 5% more for farmers. But the upcharge is all profit margin. So if you actually look at what people are paying for organic produce, they're usually paying 50% to 100% more on a comparable product. And the profit margin is about 32% higher than conventional produce. So it really is a marketing ploy. But the bigger problem is that organic farming uses pesticides. And just because they're naturally derived chemicals does not mean they're better. So here's an example here. These are all fungicides that would be used on berry crops in the US. So we have sulfur, elemental sulfur, and copper sulfate. These are two pesticides that are approved for use in organic farming, because organic farming merely means that the pesticides used have to be a chemical that exists somewhere in nature. It can't be synthetically altered to improve the chemical structure. And so these are naturally occurring chemicals. They are used as pesticides, in this instance, to control fungus that would kill berry crops, and they are more toxic. So if you look at copper sulfate, this is a commonly used fungicide. You have to use about 1 to 4 pounds of copper sulfate per acre, and it is more than 22 times more toxic than the synthetic alternative mancozeb. So mancozeb is the synthetic fungicide that's used in conventional farming. It's 22 times less toxic, and that's based on the LD50. So the LD50 is the dose at which would kill 50% of animals in a group. And so the lower the dose, the more toxic the substance is, because less of that thing would kill more animals.
So for people on audio, the LD50 for the copper
Yes.
sulfate is 300 versus 8,000 for
Correct.
the mancozeb.
Correct. Now, on top of copper sulfate being 22 times more toxic, it has to be used more frequently and at a higher quantity for the same acreage. So typically, copper sulfate is going to be used 3 to 6 times in a single berry season, and it has 22 times more toxic threshold, whereas mancozeb is usually only used twice during a berry season. And so you're using less of it, it's less toxic. And ultimately, that means that it's going to allow farmers to use fewer pesticides that they're going to be exposed to, that you could theoretically be exposed to, and they're going to be more effective.
So how do we get into the situation where something that's more toxic and costs a lot more money, and then they wrap it up and people pay even more money than it actually costs percent-wise to grow it? How do we get into the situation where people think this is a good thing?
Yeah. So, I mean, ultimately, it all comes down to good marketing. So, the organic farming industry was actually created because of political lobbyists, and they pushed the USDA to create the National Organic Program, which is a certification that organic farmers, including the Organic Growers Association, that was a big lobbyist, they wanted to create so that they could legitimize their farming methods. And it was a way to basically allow them to then slap this label on and be like, this is why I'm charging you more, because we're doing this. It has nothing to do with the safety of the farming methods or the safety of the food products or the nutrition of the food products, because organic produce is not more nutritious or safer or healthier or anything. But they did a really, really good job of marketing this starting in the 1990s by pushing this as the more natural version of farming. They're using natural substances to control pests. Now, even though we know that natural doesn't mean safer, most people do not. And so this is the appeal to nature fallacy, right? The false belief that natural is inherently better than something synthetic, when the reality is the thing that determines the safety of a substance is the actual chemical structure. And whether it's natural, whether it's synthetic, doesn't mean anything. It means what you look at is what that actual chemical does when it interacts with your body and at what dose does it do that.
This lie has been so convincing to people. I was
It's
actually in a
so
restaurant.
convincing.
They had tomato soup on the menu, and it said organic tomato soup. And I actually was talking over with my friends at the table. I wish it didn't say organic.
I
And the
know.
waiter heard me, and he said no one ever.
Yeah, I know. It's really frustrating, and it's one of the most pervasive things. And so I try to, and we see this, not just in the farming, because, this also has ecological impacts. We have lower yield and it uses more land and it's actually more ecologically intensive. But people that are lower income, if they can't afford the organic produce and they've been told that the conventional stuff is covered in toxic pesticides, which it's not, too, because those are more regulated for safety and thresholds for, residues. Those residues are not posing risk because your finished produce is not covered in pesticides, right? We're using these during the growing cycle on soil, at roots, and so on. But especially lower income people, if they've been told for years and years and years, because of the environmental working group, and the environmental working group is funded by organic farming corporations, so they push this rhetoric. Well, if they can't afford the organic food and they've been told the conventional produce is poison, well, what are they going to do? They're not going to eat produce because they can't afford it. And so now you're talking about health impacts of not eating fruits and vegetables and fiber, yet people are screaming about food dyes and not encouraging people and reassuring them about the safety of conventionally grown fruits and vegetables. So, and this really comes down to it, is people don't have any clue how pesticides are used in farming. And so, like, this was a comment that was on one of my social media posts where I was trying to address misinformation about glyphosate, which is an herbicide, meaning it is a chemical that only impacts plants. And this person was like, I'm done with you. Non-organic bananas, potatoes, and all foods that are deeply sprayed with glyphosate are not safe. Organic is a much safer option with much less chemical outputs, better for the environment. So this person is basically saying that glyphosate, which is an herbicide, meaning it's used to control weeds that would strangle farm crops. So think about when weeds might strangle a farm crop, when they're tiny little seedlings, right? By the time they're a fully grown plant or even fruiting or producing vegetables, you're not really concerned about weeds, right? Because the plant's strong enough to withstand that. But this person thinks that their finished food products are sprayed with an herbicide. Nobody's taking a banana and spraying it with glyphosate. There's no weeds growing out of a banana. But this is because we're so far removed from this chemical understanding and even how our food is produced that the public doesn't know when and how pesticides are used. And then instead, you're going to get these articles on how to get rid of all the glyphosate residue on your potatoes when there's not even glyphosate used in growing potatoes.
Andrea, every single week I get something in my mailbox with a class action suit,
Yes.
trying to sign me up because, they're going to sue for people who've gotten cancer from glyphosate.
Yes. Yeah. And RFK Jr. actually started those lawsuits. So he
Not a
made
shock.
he made a lot of money scaring people about farming. So, you play your family feud, right? All the claims you've heard about glyphosate. Well, everything's drenched in it. It causes all these chronic diseases. It kills the planet. It's killing the pollinators twice. It encourages GMO use, and those are also causing cancer, and it's extremely toxic, right? And it's giving you cancer every second, right? And these are things that have circulated, even though this substance has been studied for decades upon decades upon decades. There are thousands of studies on this substance. And people, especially liberal people who think they believe in science and they support vaccines and they support novel cancer treatments, they will fight you to the death and try to convince you that glyphosate causes cancer. So just to quickly run through the mechanism. So glyphosate is a chemical that interferes with an enzyme that only plants have. And the reason plants have it is because plants make their own amino acids, right? They photosynthesize. They're not eating food. They make their own food. And so this enzyme is required to make certain amino acids that make proteins that allow the plants to stand up, be structural. So glyphosate interferes with that enzyme. Without that enzyme, that plant can't make those amino acids, and it wilts and it dies. So scientists did a really cool thing by swapping out that enzyme that only plants have with a different version that bacteria have, and that particular version isn't interfered with by glyphosate. So in the presence of glyphosate, that plant doesn't wilt. And so it allows you to create the crop plant that has this bacterial version, and then you can control the weeds without having to worry about inadvertently killing your crops. And when you look at other herbicides that are used to control weeds in farming, glyphosate is the safest of all of them, including herbicides used in organic farming. And so if you look at glyphosate, so glyphosate has an LD50 of about 5,500 milligrams per kilogram, which means that it's pretty non-toxic. You compare it to other conventional herbicides like allichlor, metallochlor, or cyanazine. These are usually at least 2 times more toxic, sometimes more. And then also when you compare it to herbicides used in organic farming, like 20% acetic acid, which is concentrated vinegar, or clove oil, those are about 2 times more toxic than glyphosate. But that nuance, that context never comes up when you're hearing conversation about glyphosate. And then on top of that, people are always like, well, the usage has skyrocketed, right? Skyrocketed. But they leave out the fact that glyphosate, because it's so much less toxic and effective, it replaced all of those other herbicides that were actually worse, right? They had worse ecological impacts. They were riskier for farmers to use. So by swapping for glyphosate, we phased out these other herbicides that would have been used in the past. And again, you don't have that context when you have this conversation because people are like, well, just don't use pesticides. But, they're thinking about their backyard garden. They're not thinking about growing thousands of acres of food for people. And so that's context that's always lacking when you have these discussions. And the problem is that the lobbyists from these organizations, when they're talking to policymakers, that context is never part of that discussion.
Well, yeah, and then they're going to say, well, I'm seeing, lawsuits about glyphosate. I'm not seeing lawsuits about cyanazine, so that must be the safe one.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, you have all the headlines where they exacerbate this. And again, politicians are members of the public, right? So they're seeing these headlines. They're getting these kind of seeds of doubt planted. And then, of course, people conflate these lawsuits with evidence, which we know is not how lawsuits work. And so this kind of makes this snowball effect based on this appeal to nature fallacy. And then this kind of moves into your fear of genetically engineered crops, right? So we see this graphic all the time, right? You have someone injecting a mystery substance into a tomato and saying, this is GMO. But that's not what GMO is, right? A GMO is a genetically modified organism. And I kind of hate that phrase because everything is technically genetically modified. Humans are genetically modified because they're a consequence of sexual reproduction, which means that genes of the parents are modified when they're combined, but that's another discussion. But essentially, if you're looking at a GMO or genetically engineered plant, this is something that was gene modified using genetic engineering technologies as opposed to radiation or other types of mutagenesis or selective breeding. But the plant looks exactly the same as any other plant, right? It doesn't look like you're injecting a tomato. Nobody's injecting a tomato with anything because that's not the actual plant, right? The plant is the thing that's growing in the soil. But, the scary looking picture of the tomato getting injected with something is where the logic goes out the window. People are like, oh my God, I don't want my tomato injected with something when I buy it. And the problem is, again, here, people who are opposed to GMOs know the least objectively about them, and they don't care what the data say. So if you look at people's objective knowledge about GMOs and their self-assessed knowledge, meaning what they believe they know about it, this is a great example of the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? As people oppose GMOs more and more, their objective knowledge decreases, but they think they know the most. And those people will then respond with things like, you're wrong, GM foods aren't safe, who's paying you off, right? They immediately go to the shill gambit. And of those people who were most opposed to GMOs, they could not correctly answer, does a non-genetically modified tomato have genes? And the answer is yes, it does. Every organism has genes. It doesn't matter what it is. But the problem is that those people also are part of our society. They vote, they are politicians, they participate in policy making, they do protests, they lobby, they, are outspoken online. And so this refusal to acknowledge 30 plus years of data on the safety of GM foods is measurably harming our society. But you look at the demographics, the ideology of people who are most opposed to GM foods, it's by gender. So women are the people that are generally most opposed to GM foods. And this is often because they're the ones that are doing the food buying, the caretaking for the household. And so they're often the ones that are kind of most in tune to like what's going on in food shopping and branding. The non-GMO project, for example, is a marketing ploy that scares people about foods that don't even have a GM option. But if you look at the general population, more people today think that GM foods are worse for you health-wise than in 2016, which is kind of sad. And there's a huge disparity between the public belief, where 57% think that they're unsafe, compared to scientists, where 90% of them think that they're safe. And you see that this is mirrored, the GM beliefs mirrors the organic. And this is because there are a couple of GM foods that use synthetic pesticides like glyphosate. And so organic is often conflated with GMO. They're related, they're different, but it's all born in this appeal to nature fallacy, because GM foods are frankenfoods, right? This was also branded by people like RFK. And so people have this image conjured in their head of these unnatural substances, and unnatural has this emotion associated of it of being harmful. And this has tangible harms. So there was not the only example, but there have been bans on genetically engineered alfalfa and sugar beets in certain regions of Oregon. And as a result, they're not able to grow these crops there. And the problem is that genetically engineered crops have actually allowed us to reduce overall pesticide use, reduce the environmental impact of pesticides, and also increase crop yield. So by making these policy decisions based on disinformation and the appeal to nature fallacy, we're actually worsening our health, we're worsening the ability to produce food, and we're worsening the environment. And a lot of people that, are opposed to GMOs, they consider themselves to be environmentally conscious, and that's one of the reasons why they want to buy organic. They think it's pesticide free, they think it's better for the environment, but the reality is it's actually in opposition to that. So one of the things that I like to use is kind of an analogy to other fields of science. So if you come across someone who is really opposed to GMO crops, but they're on board with biomedical advancements, you can try to explain to them that the underlying science principles between making a GM crop and making a cancer cell therapy are actually almost the same. So essentially, when you make a cancer cell therapy, like a CAR T therapy, what you're basically doing is you're taking immune cells and you're genetically engineering them to recognize a cancer cell better when it's put back into your body, so it will seek and destroy the cancer. And so you take out the immune cells, you genetically engineer them to have a piece of DNA that's going to, produce a protein that's going to recognize a cancer cell, and then you're going to grow those up and you're going to put them back into a patient, and it's going to seek and destroy the cancer. And we have dozens of these approved for cancer treatments, and they've significantly improved cure rates, mortality, quality of life. If you look at how we make GMO crops, we kind of do the same exact thing with plant cells. So we take plant cells, and instead of, genetically engineering the immune cells, we take a bacteria called Agrobacterium tumefaciens that normally already infects plant cells. And we put a little piece of DNA in there that's going to have this gene that we want. And we let the bacteria infect it. It's going to transfer that gene to the plant cells. You grow the plant cells up in the lab just like you would the immune cells, and they grow into little plantlings. And then those plantlings have this gene that you've put in, a beneficial trait, whether it's producing its own pest resistance, it's adding more nutrients, it's being able to tolerate this herbicide so you can use just one herbicide instead of multiple ones. And now you grow up these plants that have this beneficial trait. So the underlying principle of the science is the same. And so one of the ways to get people to reframe their beliefs is to kind of try to challenge, what's the opposition here if you're for the same principle in medicine. So anti-vaccine rhetoric or anti-vaccine beliefs are really interesting because they straddle ideologies, right? The OG anti-vaccine activists were liberals, right? The granola heads, as I like to call them, the people that were scared of all the toxins in the vaccines. And that really started with the lies of Andrew Wakefield and claiming that all the vaccine ingredients cause autism. And so it's all born out of concern for their children, right? Which is why it's effective. You're scaring people about the livelihoods of the humans that they produce. So this is a really effective message. When you look at a lot of the conservative skepticism, a lot of it relates to government control, government overreach, not wanting to be told what to do, a lot of this libertarian rhetoric. And so the way to tackle anti-vaccine rhetoric, it's going to differ depending on who you're talking to and what their motivation is. And so it's particularly challenging, especially nowadays, because we have kind of radical belief systems on either ideological end that actually overlap, right? You have a lot of this kind of fringe radical misinformation that, your left and your right arms of the political wings, they actually are more like a circle than a line, right? Because of the extreme politicization of vaccines, you see that the trust in vaccines has declined across the board, but the biggest decline has been across Republicans. And this has been something that has really been seized upon during COVID, but has been used to expand to every other vaccine. But the problem is that, we're seeing this right now, right? The consequences are life-threatening. We have one of the most virulent anti-vaccine activists and anti-science activists who's now in charge of all of the health agencies of our country. They're trying to revoke all of the CDC ACIP recommendations for vaccines. They are postponing review meetings where they look at vaccine recommendations and guidance and potential new approvals of vaccines. We have a huge measles outbreak. I pulled this on the 21st. We're over 100 cases now. States are trying to ban mRNA vaccines because they're calling that gene therapy. And this is coming from everybody, right? Jim Carrey. I mean, this was an old one, but he's still an anti-vaxxer. And he kind of aligned with the autism and the poison and the toxins. And then, of course, you have the people with the appeal to nature fallacy talking about natural immunity being superior than vaccine immunity. But the reality is that this rejection of science, because of these strongly held belief systems, which, I mean, we've got 300 years of evidence of immunizations being effective. It's causing people to lose their lives, and mostly children. And so with this appeal to nature fallacy, you've got the natural immunity versus the vaccines. You have the people who are opposed to vaccines because they're all synthetic, yet they will enthusiastically take unregulated dietary supplements because they perceive them to be natural and therefore safe and therefore beneficial, even though we have lots of data to show that not only are they often not beneficial, they're often not safe, and they're not regulated, right? And so again, you have this belief system where people who subscribe to kind of this wellness landscape of this all natural healing, this all natural, supporting your health, and they will often reject the things they perceive to be unnatural, even if those have evidence that they're safe and beneficial and improve your health. And there's a component of medical conspiracism here. So medical conspiracism is the belief that the government or the powers that be are hiding information or hiding treatments from the public in order to control them and keep them sick. And so there was a study that was done that looked at people who believed in medical conspiracies, including we're hiding the cures for cancer, that cell phones cause cancer, but nobody's going to stop it because there's corporate interest, that HIV was a ploy by the CIA to infect Black people, that GMOs are a ploy to depopulate the planet, that fluoride in the water is, trying to poison people, and so on, right? They're all things that RFK Jr. has said, by the way. These are all things that he said. These are all things that have been entrenched into the wellness industry and medical conspiracism. And the reason that it's entrenched in the wellness industry is because in order to get people to buy into that, you have to erode their trust in science, right? In healthcare. But the concerning part here is that as number of medical conspiracies that someone believes increased, they also participated in more wellness behaviors like buying organic food and taking supplements and, going to the pharmacy and getting the all natural stuff. So that makes sense. But on the flip side, they also decreased participation in things that actually had evidence. So getting their physical, getting their flu shot, going to the dentist, wearing sunscreen, all the things that we know actually do improve health outcomes, reduce the rates of cancer, improve the dental health, reduce the rates of cavities, reduce communicable disease, and all of that. And so you have this very, very distinct split where the wellness industry kind of positions itself as this natural, beneficial, altruistic thing because it's the alternative that the government isn't hiding from you. And so this is like a confluence of all of the logical fallacies that we see. And it's exploited to erode trust in people that are promoting evidence, that are aligning with medical professionals, and that it's all like this conspiracy where you're brainwashed and you're malicious. And, no one's hiding natural cures for cancer. So these are all plants that exist, and they are all used to make cures for cancer. So we've got the Pacific yew, which was used to isolate paclitaxel, which is actually still used to treat cancer. It's called Taxol. But they took paclitaxel and they tweaked it chemically, synthetically, to make a safer version that's more effective for more cancer types called docetaxel, with science to make better cures for cancer. The same thing is true for something like the Chinese happy tree, where we were able to take camtothecin and we made topotecan from it, because camtothecin is quite toxic. It has really bad side effects, and you had to take a lot of it to actually have an effect to kill cancer. But by tweaking it with chemistry, making it synthetic, now you have topotecan, which is actually a much more effective cancer treatment. And then the last one, you have the May apple, which produces a lot of chemicals called podophyllotoxins. Those also were effective at killing cancer cells, but again, had a lot of side effects, toxic at low doses. So again, it was tweaked synthetically to make etoposide, and that is a currently used, very effective cancer treatment. So nobody's hiding the natural cures for cancer. We take what we learn from nature and we use science to improve upon it. But by convincing people there's a conspiracy, it makes it that much more easy to convince them to reject the evidence. And just like the anti-vaccine rhetoric, this appeal to nature fallacy, it kills people. So I don't know if any of you have watched Apple Cider Vinegar, but they're true stories of people that were around, about a decade ago. And the cancer pseudoscience is not new. People have been claiming that they have the natural cures to cancer, the natural medicines. You can do it at home. You can just do it with your diet. Cancer isn't a big deal. And the problem is when this gets entrenched with we're hiding the cures to cancer. They're just trying to keep you sick. Chemotherapy is toxic and it's killing you. People die. So if you look at outcomes of patients with the most common cancer types, and you look at survival or you look at risk of death, if people forego conventional treatments for alternatives like supplements and diet and homeopathy and chiropractic, the rate of survival drops substantially. And so, for example, with breast cancer, normally nowadays with mammography, 5-year survival rate of breast cancer is over 90%. It's really quite astonishing how improved we've done with science. But if you opt out of it, the 5-year survival plummets to 58.1%, and there's a 5.7-fold increased risk of death due to breast cancer, which is almost fully curable in this day and age. And the same goes for colorectal cancer, where the outcomes are actually far worse, and as well as with lung cancer. And so this appeal to nature fallacy and this medical conspiracism is costing people their lives, and it's preventable. And you see this all over, right? And you see celebrities promoting this, right? Ananda Lewis, this was a story that came out a few months ago. She first refused to get mammograms because she was convinced that the radiation was going to cause cancer. So she didn't get mammograms for years and years and years. By the time she did get a mammogram, she had stage 3 breast cancer, and she refused to get a mastectomy. And so instead, she went to a chiropractor, she got IV vitamins, she did homeopathy, and now her breast cancer is stage 4, which means it's incurable. Her 5-year survival went from about 60% if it was stage 3 to about 20% with a stage 4. And this was something, again, because she believed in the wellness disinformation. And so when you talk about if wellness is bad news for healthcare, which is an article I wrote for MedPage, the answer is absolutely yes, because you're taking this medical conspiracism and you're taking these people's ideologies, right? The things that evoke this emotional response, this kind of fear of chemicals, this fear of unnatural substances, and you exploit that to convince them to make decisions that are killing themselves.
So again, for people who can't read this, the person that you're showing in your left panel is
Oh, yes. This is
Jessica Ains.
Yes, Jessica Ainscough, who is the one of the characters in Apple Cider Vinegar, although she was renamed. So she had a very rare cancer. She was diagnosed in her 20s. And she opted to do Garrison therapy, which is a very dangerous, unproven regimen, which basically does coffee enemas and juices and organic food, and she died at the age of 30 because her cancer, not only was it rare, it was aggressive. These coffee enemas and juicing did do nothing for it. And the problem is that she had this huge social media following of this wellness advocate, and she convinced a lot of other people to kind of subscribe to what she was promoting as well. And she probably truly believed this until it got to be too bad, and these sorts of things continue to pervade society. Elle Macpherson did this whole song and dance about how she cured her breast cancer holistically, and she dated Andrew Wakefield at the time.
I didn't know that.
Just as an FYI, and she said, she went to a chiropractor and she went to a naturopath and she did this. Well, she left out the fact that she had a lumpectomy, and early stage breast cancer, a lumpectomy is often curative, but she chose to omit that from her little memoir about how she cured her breast cancer holistically. And so when you have celebrities deliberately misleading people and leaving out information, and then you have media outlets amplifying it because they're celebrities, now the general public is going to come across that and they're going to say, hey, I just got diagnosed with early stage breast cancer. Maybe I don't need this lumpectomy after all, because Elle Macpherson said she didn't need it,
Yeah, Jessica's Wikipedia page. I just put it in the chat for people here in this meeting, but people can look that up on Wikipedia who are just listening to this. And it's a very sad story. It tells the whole story.
It's a very sad story. Yeah. And then, you have this same medical conspiracism converging with your anti-government cognitive dissonance, right? And this is really this MAHA movement, right? This Make America Healthy movement, which has been picked up by RFK Jr. and the various lobbyists like Callie Means that are associated with him. But this has been a long time in the works. There was a panel, a roundtable in Congress earlier, well, not this year, last year, where all these people who were claim to be experts in health and nutrition were there to kind of undermine legitimate science, right? And so you had Marty Makary, who is, of course, potentially going to be one of our science leadership roles. You had RFK Jr., you had Callie Means, you had Vani Hari, the food baby, you had Jillian Michaels, who has zero anything. You also had a a supplement company lobbyist named Brigham Bueller. And you had a random teenage girl who's convinced herself that she's now an expert in cancer epigenetics. But basically, it was this performative, show in front of our leaders, making lies about cancer, spreading lies about food ingredients, and being held up as this, source of ground truth. And then you had a lot of media outlets who started to say more healthier. And it's like, no, he doesn't actually, because he's the one that spread the misinformation about glyphosate causing cancer. And it doesn't, right? But it kind of plays on this. Well, the government it doesn't, it's not looking out for you. It's poisoning you. It's allowing all these unregulated and untested and poisonous food ingredients in there, right? And so you had the food babe who was, pushing so hard to, well, we need the safer cereal, right? We need Fruit Loops needs to change one coloring for a different coloring, and that is going to cure the food issues that we have in the US, right? Which is completely ridiculous, right? Because unless your entire diet is Fruit Loops, who cares? If there's one food dye in one versus one food dye in another. The irony, though, is that the example she's using the Australian version or the European version, and she's talking about how the red 40 is the really bad red dye and it's banned in other countries, and it's not banned. But what they would sub it in for, or what they would sub it out for, would be something like carmine, which is a naturally derived red coloring as opposed to synthetic one. So again, we have this appeal to nature fallacy, but also big food and anti-government. But carmine, also called cochineal, is derived from insects, and it can cause allergic reactions in people. And in the US, it requires a warning label. So it's not automatically safer, but she doesn't know anything about toxicology. And so she's just like, well, Australians is better because they're using natural colorings, and vegetable carbon and copper chlorophyll, which are a black color and a green color, they're actually banned in the US. So but again, it's all about kind of this performative risk perception gap, appeal to nature fallacy. And it exploits this chemophobia, which is kind of the final piece of the puzzle, right? Telling people that things are toxic and things cause cancer and all these chemicals are bad and these synthetic chemicals and these artificial chemicals, because now everybody is anxious and fearful about these substances. And we know that anything can be toxic at a certain dose, right? Water can be toxic if you drink 5 liters of it at once. And oxygen can be toxic if you inhale a high enough concentration of it. And water can be toxic if you inhale it, but it's okay if you ingest it. And it can also be toxic if you inject it. But again, this requires this science literacy. And it's much easier to just make these claims talking about toxic chemicals. And so you see this in policy, right? California banned 6 food dyes. And the whole claim is that they're causing cancer and they're banned in other countries. And neither of those things are true. But the sponsors of the bills were anti-science lobbyist groups. And this looks like he's doing all of this work to make our food safer, yet we're not addressing food deserts. We're not addressing, people's inability to access fruits and vegetables. The whole of California Proposition 65 is chemophobia masquerading as concern for help, because did you know that any single politician in the California state legislature can just add a chemical to that list without any evidence that it's even posing a risk to people at any dose that people would actually be exposed to? So everything could be potentially on the Prop 65 list, and they're all linked to this, well, it causes cancer or it causes birth defects. But there's no actual evidence that nearly all of those substances do that at levels that people would be exposed to.
Thank you for that explanation. I've always wondered why that label is on pretty much everything I ever buy.
Yeah, it's I mean, most people just ignore it
Yeah.
because it's essentially, people are saturated, and it's essentially meaningless. And it was all under this, well, we want people to be aware of what they're being exposed to, but it's on pretty much everything, because anybody who's an elected leader in the state legislature can just be like, well, I'm going to add this to the list. It's
I actually had this on a generator I bought, and I'm kind of
yeah.
like, it's because cancer and birth defects are, they're like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, I was out in California for some work over the summer, and the side of the hotel building that I stayed at had a Prop 65 sign. I was like, "Oh, good. The
The
whole
hotel,
hotel.
the whole hotel.
The
Okay.
whole hotel." And I've touched on this a little bit when I've written a little bit about policy and that but I do want to dig in more about it because I think once upon a time maybe it had good intentions and it's really just been manipulated really grossly. And then of course you have the Hawaii sunscreen ban, and the whole claim was, well, you're banning the organic UV filters because they're killing coral reefs, except they're not actually killing coral reefs, certainly not at the levels that would ever end up in water. And ironically, zinc oxide, which is a mineral sunscreen, is more toxic to coral reefs at similar doses, but neither of them are toxic at levels that they would end up in the water. But what ends up happening is that because these organic sunscreens, these chemical sunscreens, are more pleasant to use and most people prefer them, if they're not allowed, now they're just not going to wear sunscreen. And so now you have this, okay, you're banning something and now they're not wearing something that prevents skin cancer, and this whole claim that it's harming reefs has no data to support it. And even the best coral reef scientists have said that it's not even on the top 100 lists of concerns that they would have about coral reef safety.
Well, and I've also been hearing lately too about information going around, especially with maybe younger generations, thinking that you shouldn't wear sunscreen at
Oh my
all
gosh,
because the
yes.
chemicals in it will cause cancer, like failing to
Yes.
recognize that the sun damage will cause
Yes.
cancer. You're preventing it.
There's a huge movement right now, and that's really with the medical conspiracism. That sunscreens are some conspiracy to, keep people sick. And we didn't see skin cancer until sunscreens started. And so it's not the sun, it's the sunscreens that are causing the skin cancer and the other cancers. And there's a huge movement of people who are just actively telling people to not wear sunscreen.
When Gwyneth Paltrow famously said, the sun can't hurt you, nothing that's natural can hurt you," something to that effect.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
yeah, yeah. So, and then of course, again, you have all these policy decisions that are being made by these uninformed, misinformed, anti-science rhetoric. And of course, I pulled the actual acceptable daily intake levels of all of these food dyes that are actually not banned in other countries. It's on my website, so I won't go into it too much. But basically, the Environmental Working Group and Consumer Reports sponsored this California bill. Um, there are several of these food dyes that actually have higher daily consumption thresholds in other countries than they do in the US. And none of them are impacting health at levels. You would have to eat, I don't know, like 90 bags of Skittles to even hit these thresholds of any of these food dyes. And if that's your diet, I think there's a far bigger concern than the food dyes that you're eating. But of course, that's a bigger conversation. But it comes down to this, right? People don't understand that chemistry is everything and that the dose makes the poison, and these fundamental principles of toxicology are true for everything, right? There was a study that was done, and they looked at Europeans, and 40% of the respondents wanted to live in a world free from chemicals. And so this is my little ingredient list of just a selection of chemicals in humans. And 82% of those people in that study didn't know that table salt was table salt, whether it was extracted from ocean water or was made synthetically in a lab. And 91% of people didn't realize that the dose makes the poison for everything, whether it's synthetic or natural. And so it speaks to this, gap in science literacy that people are being exploited by and making decisions that are based on emotions or based on their communities or based on beliefs or based on just repetition of misinformation. And, when we think about it, everything is science, right? People are fearful of all these scientific interventions that have improved our lives, yet they enthusiastically consume science in pretty much all other facets of their lives without a second thought, right? If you drive a car, a combustible engine, or even an electric car, that's science, right? That makes your car. Everything about your car is because of science. Your smartphone, That's science. Whether you can bake a cupcake at home, that's science and also a chemical reaction. Your smart TV, even just having a TV, that's science. Your home, your plumbing, your lighting, your electricity, your roof that can withstand the elements, all of that is because of science and scientific data. Your ability to have a flush toilet, your ability to have plumbing, your ability to be free from fecal illnesses, that's all because of science. And so, people have this disconnect in terms of how much science impacts them. And then it ultimately allows them to be scared about science because they have this disconnect. And so if you actually look the majority of people don't feel comfortable or confident to talk about chemistry, or they don't realize how important it is in their daily lives, right? You are alive. You exist because of chemical reactions happening in your body at all times, right? Your body is a network of chemicals that are stuck together to make all of your cells and your tissues and all of the things. But most people don't think about chemistry or even can recollect things about basic chemistry beyond their elementary or high school education. And in order to have better science literacy, to make better policy, we need the public to get on board with this, right? We need the public understanding, because politicians are often making decisions about these things based on who's going to vote for them. And it's sad that that's the reality, but we need the public to operate with better science literacy and better science informed decisions, because that's going to impact everyone. And so this is kind of this little kind of snowball effect that I've created. So you have this media sensationalism that leads to the spread of misinformation, that causes consumer fears, that leads to this public outcry, that then triggers the market, right? Whether you're talking about a food product or a skincare product or a medicine or a pesticide. And then that's going to impact raw materials. It's going to impact formulation. It's going to impact the science behind it. But by doing that, by conceding, then you legitimize the misinformation. And then from there, the legitimization of it leads to the anti-science policies, anti-science laws. And that means that there's going to be regulatory interference with our safety agencies. That's going to impact potentially other industries, right? If you're banning a chemical in a food that's also used in a medicine, like Red 3, which is used in a medicine I take, that's going to now impact the medicine industry. And then that's going to lead to worse economic outcomes, worse health outcomes, and ultimately all of us are going to be harmed. So everyone can play a role in this because we all live in a collective society. And I know right now it doesn't feel like there's a lot of concern for others, as measles is rampant. But, scientists and experts, they have to educate, they have to not overstep their expertise, because, there's a reason that people think that one person can know everything. And it's because of this conflation. And we really have to discuss things in this lay person summary language, because otherwise it's really easy to manipulate and it's really easy to spread misinformation. And we need the media to participate because they are hugely complicit in all of this. And I will save my rant about that for another day. But we also need companies to approach misinformation as a public health threat. And whether that is a farming organization or a medicine agency or a biotech company, but, there needs to be infrastructure to combat this, because otherwise we're playing this game of whack-a-mole and nobody's going to come out better for it. I love this quote by Feynman. It says, "I believe that science has remained irrelevant because we wait until somebody asks us questions or until we are invited to give a speech on Einstein's theory to people who don't understand Newtonian mechanics, but we are never invited to give an attack on faith, healing, or astrology. I suggest, maybe incorrectly and perhaps wrongly, that we are too polite." And he said that in 1964. And I would say this is still true. And this is really why pseudoscience and wellness and anti-science rhetoric has really overtaken us, because I think scientists generally are cautious in their language and they don't want to overstep. They don't want to be too forceful. They don't want to be viewed as impolite. But I think there's a big difference between being matter of fact and correcting objective falsehoods and being impolite, right? We don't need to handhold when we're trying to combat misinformation. And so this is really kind of where I bring it home, because if you look at who people trust, they trust people that they view like them. their peers, their colleagues, their friends, their families. They trust those people more than they trust legitimate experts on topics, and certainly more than they trust journalists and government and so on. So you can leverage that even if you're not a scientific expert, right? Use the information from a trusted source and be that trusted messenger. Because that ideology, that trust, that relationship, parasocial relationship, real relationship, community, that plays a bigger role in whether or not someone's going to believe information than how truthful the information actually is. And then, of course, you can help fact check too. So every time you see something, you can ask three questions to start. These are from the Media Literacy Project. So who's the source? What's the motive? And can you verify it with other credible sources? And always take a beat, right? If something is evoking really strong emotions, as soon as you come across it, like you have this knee-jerk reaction, oh my God, I need to share this with somebody. That's usually a sign that it's misleading, whether it's a positive emotion or a negative emotion. So that 30-second pause can do a lot to help you do a gut check of that. And that's all I've got.
That is great. And for people who are watching visually, you can see how to get in touch with Andrea there. But for folks who are listening later on, we'll put those links in the show notes. But I'll drop the link also to Andrea's website as well, immunologic.org. Let me drop that in. Thank you for all of that. That was a whole lot of information in a short amount of time. And I loved your slides.
Yeah, I was going through, I was like, oh man, I should have just cut that piece out. But
No.
there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of thematic elements that cross over when you really sit down and think about, where we got to where we got in the
Mhm.
last couple of decades.
Yeah, and, I know we need to go to Q&A, but before we do, I would love to hear if you could unpack even more for us. We talked a little bit about kind of where this sort of mistrust of credible information has crept in so many different ways and from seemingly, like, opposite sources. Um, what do you see as the influence of religion or faith on how people have also gotten mixed up in some of this mistrust and misinformation?
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating because I think that it's not the religion itself or the faith itself. I think it's bad actors manipulating the religion. Because if you look at a lot of the faith leaders, in a lot of different religious sects, they've often come out to kind of try to combat and stand up for science and vaccines and same-sex marriage, abortion rights. I mean, Ireland, it has more abortion, more abortion access than the US does. And so what ends up happening is, there's a radical person, a person who wants to leverage the religion as this tool to say, well, if you are a true believer, then you're going to also believe what I'm saying here. And so they weaponize the person's religious beliefs for harm. But if you actually look at the religious texts of pretty much all religions, when they're not manipulated, they're really a moral guideline, right? It's often when they get bastardized or manipulated into something that they're not actually, then they're used to say, okay, well, this religion is telling you that you're not allowed to do this, or this religion is telling you that you should not believe in this thing. And so it's often people form a relationship with a certain leader that's not representing the religion accurately, but because they have that emotional tie to that person, they then kind of follow them. And it's a lot of what you see with cults and a lot of what you see with the wellness industry. There's a lot of this kind of this this ecosystem of this kind of person that they're looking to for trust and guidance, and it's nothing about the actual fundamental concept of the religion or the ethos or the philosophy to begin with.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting. I saw the resistance to the vaccines when they were released, and actually the masks before that, in fundamentalist sects of both Judaism, because I'm near a very Orthodox Jewish community, and also all of my relatives who are fundamentalist Christians. So it's like fundamentalism for some reason
Yeah,
lends
it's
itself to that.
it's really fascinating, and I almost wonder, and I'm not a religious expert, but I almost wonder if it has something to do with like the rigidity of the like the lifestyle, the orthodoxy of it, or something that kind of lends itself to, okay, well, our teachings prescribe this and this, and anything that deviates from that must be something that we need to refuse. And it's interesting because, I saw similar trends where you had more conservative, sects of Judaism, Orthodox, and so on, versus, secular Jews or so on, and they're very disparate in kind of their
Yep.
general beliefs and, how they interpret Judaism in their day-to-day lives. And so, you know, again, I think it really is shaped by that kind of community itself and not, the overarching religion, but it's how that religion is interpreted or as I said, I think it's a manipulation in order to kind of coerce people to behave in a certain way.
It also seems that the fundamentalist aspects lends itself to God is in control. So don't worry about what's happening here.
Yes.
God will save us.
That's,
There
yeah,
was
that's,
actually a viral meme, a viral video that went around early in the pandemic when they were trying to close down religious services, and there was a woman refusing that, going to, I think it was a Christian service, and yeah, it had to be in a Christian park, and she was parking in the parking lot of a church, and a reporter with a mask stuck a microphone through the window and said, "Why are you here?" And she said, "I am protected by the blood of Jesus." I mean,
yeah,
that was it.
yeah, it's a great point. I mean, I think we see this a lot with a lot of the health pseudoscience, right? With the people who kind of claim that you can like hack your health, you can boost your immune system, you can do this, right? Because it's very scary for a lot of people to feel like they don't have control over their health, right? It's really hard for a lot of people to reconcile that, like, you could do everything by the book and you could still get cancer, and you could do all of the things that are high risk for developing cancer and not get cancer, because about 60% of it is out of your control. It's kind of predetermined by a lot of the things that you have been exposed to in your life, your genetics, things that are out of your control. And for some people, that is liberating. Like for me, I'm kind of like, all right, well, everything in moderation, like, calculated risk, etc. But for other people, that can be really, really anxiety inducing. And so, they want to seek control in another way, and I think that that same approach is with people who have these fundamentalist beliefs, that they want to believe that something is predestining them for some outcome, instead of thinking that there are things out of their control that are going to impact them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oops, I was muted. I was going to say that seems like that would be very comforting, especially in a context where you're expecting to hear these kind of very definite, all-encompassing answers from that spiritual leader. You'll be okay if you do the following. Wouldn't it be great if they could also tell me my health will be okay if I just
Yes,
do the following?
absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, we have more questions. I suppose we should go to some of those. Rob, do you want to pick a question for
Well, we'll
Dr.
start with
Love?
the light one, which came up very early in the process.
Oh,
What, Andrea, is your favorite yoga pose?
oh gosh. um I'm gonna be lazy. I'm gonna say Shavasana.
Say
Because
what? Say what?
it's the lying on your back with your, arms relaxed. It's your sleeping pose. But there's a reason for it. And it's because it took me so long to actually learn how to like meditate and quiet my brain down. And for a long time I would just lay there and be antsy and be like, all right, when am I allowed to move? And now it actually, like, there are times where I almost drift off, which is quite nice.
Right.
I have to say, I enjoy that one as well. I am a very casual amateur yoga person, but I learned to enjoy that pose when I very briefly participated in, and Rob, you're going to be mad at me for this because I think this is one of those pseudoscience wellness things. But I did that hot yoga for a couple of years. And you're so miserable and exhausted by the end of it that you're so excited to lay down and do that pose because you like literally can't do anything else that I really quite enjoyed it, but I don't do that
So
program
my wife
anymore.
did a yoga, which is probably more unusual than that. She did yoga with goats, goat yoga.
Oh yeah,
I've seen
I
that.
did puppy yoga at the animal shelter, and it was very unproductive, and they were super cute, and I got like my ears chewed on and drooled. I think I got peed on at one point, but it was a lot of fun.
Oh, that's great. I would enjoy that. I've seen goat yoga before as well, and it seemed like a lot of fun, but it was very smelly, so I did not partake. Okay, let's go on to some more questions. Let's see. So, someone is asking, how do you challenge disinformation once it's taken root in people? Is there a way to help them out of it without causing them to just kind of have this immediate backlash and no, that's not true. I already know the answer.
Yeah, it's really difficult. I think there's a few things that have proven or have some data to show that they're effective, and the first is, do you have a relationship with this person, right? A trusted relationship, meaning, do they feel comfortable confiding in you, and, would they be receptive to information you're going to provide for them? So if the answer is yes, and you want to get into that, rabbit hole there, the next thing is you always want to start it with being receptive to why they believe this. So I understand that you're concerned about the risks of vaccine ingredients because you don't want to harm your child, right? That's totally what you would want to do if you're a good parent. So can you walk me through what you're concerned about and why you're concerned about it? So you want to start by giving them an opportunity to explain why they believe what they believe. And as they walk through it, you want to kind of absorb that and then see if, they're willing to have some of those things be questioned, right? And you don't want to like automatically say, no, you're wrong. You want to say, I understand why you might be concerned that there's formaldehyde in a vaccine, but did you know that you produce 850,000 times more formaldehyde, your own body, on a daily basis than might be in a vaccine? So a lot of it is, getting to a point where they're comfortable sharing their concerns and they're receptive to you asking follow-up questions about those concerns, and you can kind of insert the factual truths with kind of the reframing of that concern. Now, it takes a lot of effort, right? It's Brandolini's law, right? The order of, magnitude required to refute the falsehood is, tens, hundreds, thousand times fold more than what's required to start it in the first place. But, you know, it's worth it if you have someone who is willing. Now, not everybody's willing, or they're not willing at that moment. So, you have to get a sense of if it's the time to have that conversation. But, and sometimes you have to have that conversation multiple times, right? Maybe you just kind of start by, getting some feedback from them, trying to understand where they're coming from, and maybe it gets a little bit heated and you take a pause and you revisit it in the future. But I think, especially if you're talking about friends or family that you really care about and they've, kind of fallen for some of these things that are harmful, it's absolutely worth it to try to, take them on that journey. But just be prepared, because it is an emotional and a psychological burden for you too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. What else do we have, Rob?
Yes, well, as Andrea may remember, when I interviewed you for Skeptical Inquirer, we talked about my fear of Lyme disease and chronic Lyme disease because I had so many friends who had it, older people when I was young, and it, convinced me that, yeah, if I get bitten by a Lyme, I'm going to have this chronic disease. So we have a question about that.
Okay.
It says, I was bitten by a Lyme disease tick 2 or 3 years ago. Are there any long-term health issues stemming from Lyme disease? I keep challenging the doctor about this, and they say if I got treatment by traditional treatment, antibiotics, I should be cured. Is that correct?
That's a good question. So there's a couple of things involved there. So the first is, if it's the correct species of ticks. So, from the question, I'm going to assume that it was, a black-legged tick or a Western black-legged tick. Um, First of all, getting bitten by the tick doesn't mean that you're automatically infected. There's only a couple of species of ticks in the US that can transmit the particular bacteria, and not all of them are carrying the bacteria, right? There are certain places in the US where almost none of them are carrying the bacteria, which means even if they bit you, they wouldn't necessarily be able to spread it. And there are places like where I live where there's higher proportions of them that do. But on top of that, they have to bite and feed for a certain amount of time. It's a minimum of 24 hours, and it's actually closer to 48 hours.
That is
Um,
astounding because I never heard that before. It was like basically if they bit you, you got it.
Yeah, no, it's a very complex world of pseudoscience, the Lyme disease world. But yeah, um, my former lab actually did a lot of these kind of time course kinetic studies to look at the transmission of the bacteria. And the reason that it takes that time is because unlike certain pathogens which live in the salivary glands, as soon as a tick bites, they can get into your body. The bacteria that cause Lyme disease, they live in the compartment called the midgut. And I wish I had my ticks plush somewhere. But the midgut's like the stomach of the tick, and it's in the actual body of the tick. And what happens is when there's no blood in the tick, the bacteria kind of go dormant. They're not reproducing, they're not growing that much. And it isn't until the tick takes in the blood that they get the glucose and the oxygen and all the nutrients, and then the bacteria start reproducing. And they don't actively like swim to the salivary glands. It basically is a density thing. So they reproduce so much that they're too crowded in the midgut and they're just forced into the salivary glands. And that process takes about 24 to 48 hours. So if you remove the tick promptly within 24 hours, even if it was infected, there's almost no chance that you could get infected. But if you did get infected, we assume that you got Lyme disease and you took your antibiotics for the standard course, there's no evidence that bacteria persist after antibiotic treatment. Unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation about Lyme disease because the symptoms, if you don't notice that bullseye rash, which sometimes can be hard to spot depending on where the tick bit you, um, a lot of the other symptoms are pretty nonspecific, right? Fatigue and lethargy, joint pain, headaches, and so on. And there's a lot of other medical conditions that can present with those symptoms, including autoimmune diseases, psychological, psychiatric disorders, viral infections. And so it's become a little bit of a scapegoat in the wellness industry because there's a lot of money behind promoting kind of unproven treatments that can actually be harmful. So there's actually been a lot of studies where they've done extended clinical trials with extended antibiotic courses and looked at patient outcomes, and there's no benefit to taking extended antibiotics. So, the TLDR is if you got bit by a tick, you got your antibiotic treatment, you didn't develop kind of, some of the more symptoms of what we call disseminated Lyme disease, like joint swelling and so on, and those kind of have resolved, there's no evidence that like something's going to appear years down the line and impact you.
So to put that in context, I should have had you mention this earlier. I read it in the bio, but you're the executive director of the American Lyme Disease Foundation. So
Yes.
what does your foundation do?
Yes. So the American Lyme Disease Foundation is a group of scientists and clinical providers, so physicians who are experts in tick biology, entomology, tick-borne diseases, and Lyme disease. And it was founded or was formed in the 1990s when Lyme pseudoscience really started. And the goal is to basically provide factual information on Lyme disease, the risks of Lyme disease, the treatment misinformation versus facts. And it's an uphill battle because we pretty much are, just kind of do it in our volunteer capacity. And the Lyme activist groups, they have a lot of celebrity money behind them, so it's tough. But the goal is to just be a source of accurate information about Lyme disease because it's a public health concern, but it's definitely not as scary as most people believe it to be.
And certainly, as I was led to believe it was for most of my life.
Well, that's good to know. And with that, I think that is a great time to also share your other links. Andrea, I am going to drop all of those in the chat where people can find you on immunologic.org, as well as your Skeptical Inquirer page and your various socials. Where people can follow along and learn more, because we are about out of time. Now, before we wrap up, is there anything else that you want to leave us with?
No, I mean, I think I said a
Not to
lot.
put you on the spot, but I
No,
wanted to give you a chance if you did.
I think, the big theme that I'm always trying to get people to appreciate is that, you know, reality is always much more nuanced than people make it out to be. And I think that's true whether we're talking about, science, health, medicine, religion. I think, everything is kind of needs to be moderated a little bit, because we really live in this like, instant gratification clickbait world where people are constantly on edge. And I think, taking a pause is really just good practice for consuming any sort of information, but certainly right now, because I think that, we're in this deluge, and it feels like it's kind of never ending with bad news coming out everywhere. And the goal is to kind of make it less scary, but provide people with, one action that maybe you can take to kind of feel like you're taking some power back.
Absolutely. And Rob, you had one more question before we wrap up. We got to slide one more in, I think.
Yeah, so you mentioned the danger of measles, and people were typing in the chat about measles outbreaks that they're familiar with. And I still hear a lot of people go, oh, measles is just a childhood disease. It's not a problem. So, I'd like, while we're still recording, for you to get on record how bad that disease is.
Yeah, measles, it's not a good one. So before the measles vaccine was introduced, the first measles vaccine was developed and approved in the US in 1963, and it was an inactivated viral vaccine. And not we, because I wasn't alive then, but scientists released an attenuated measles vaccine in the early 1970s that replaced that one. It elicited a little bit more of a robust, longer acting immune response. But before the 1960s, measles killed 2.6 million people every single year. So definitely not a, you know, benign childhood illness. Now, the problem is that most people alive, except for our elderly, our oldest populations, never lived in a world where measles was common, right? There were sparse outbreaks. We have more outbreaks nowadays than we used to have even. But after the measles vaccine was introduced, we had this huge plummet in cases, and to the point where measles was declared eliminated in the US in 2000. And not that there was never a case of measles, measles was no longer endemic, meaning measles no longer existed in the US where it was transmitted within the US. The way measles was brought in since the 2000s was unvaccinated people would travel internationally to countries that it had not been eliminated in. They would pick up the virus, they would bring it back. And because of how contagious it is, it spreads when vaccine rates decline. It's the most contagious human pathogen. Um, and on top of how many people it can kill in a year, it's not just that, right? So measles is super contagious. It can hang out in the air for hours after an infected person has left the room. So you might not even know whether or not you've been exposed to it. And on top of, the risks of death, it can cause serious complications, including blindness, deafness, dehydration, which can be life-threatening in children, pneumonia, which can lead to secondary infections and respiratory failure. And it can also lead to encephalitis, which is a brain infection, and swelling. And in fact, the vast majority of encephalitis cases are caused by viral infections like measles. Now, encephalitis occurs in about 0.3% of measles cases. Now, I know that sounds like a small number, but that's pretty high. And if someone develops measles encephalitis, there's a mortality rate of about 15%. So if you looked at the 10.5 million measles cases last year in the world, about 5,000 deaths were attributed only to the encephalitis complication. There's also a condition called subacute sclerosing panencephalitis, or SSPE, which is something that occurs after measles, where someone recovers from measles and they seem fine, and then within a year, 2 years, 3 years, they develop this fatal brain disorder where basically their brain decompensates, and it's always fatal, and it occurs in 18 of every 100,000 measles cases, and there's no cure, there's no treatment, and it is almost always in kids under 5 that survive measles. On top of that, measles, because of the type of virus it is, it causes this fun phenomenon called immune amnesia, which basically means if you get infected with the measles virus, the way that it infects you is it starts by infecting immune cells in your respiratory tract after you inhale the virus, and it hitches a ride on those immune cells to your lymph nodes. And then it infects your memory immune cells, the B cells and the T cells. And when it infects those B cells and T cells, it kills them. And that means that it kills any of the memory B cells and T cells that you might have that are providing protection for other things that you've either been vaccinated against or have developed protection against because you were infected with them once upon a time. So the way that measles virus infects you, it damages memory immunity that you've developed to other things in the past. So, aside from the measles itself, say you were vaccinated against hepatitis B and diphtheria and tetanus and pertussis and polio and, hepatitis A and Haemophilus influenza B and respiratory syncytial virus. Well, theoretically, if you get measles, you don't realize it, but you've wiped out your memory protection for all these other things. So now you're susceptible to future infections from these things that you thought you were protected against. So it's definitely not a benign childhood illness, but most people don't realize how substantial it was because the peak of measles epidemic in the US was in the 1950s and the 1960s because, once we deployed that first measles vaccine in 1963, we went from 500,000 cases every year to, 50,000 cases in less than a decade. And, and people weren't alive. They don't remember that. It's that survivor bias.
Wow, that's horrible, but thank you for sharing all of that. So does RFK Jr. know all this?
I mean, he certainly has been told it many, many times. But he, of course, like in Samoa in 2019, that led to 83 people dying, mostly children. And I forget, I did the math at one point, but if you look at the population of Samoa, that would be analogous to like several 100,000 people in the US dying from measles. And that is partly because he actively wrote a letter to the Prime Minister of Samoa to spread his children's health defense misinformation and discourage the mandatory vaccine campaign that they had launched once the outbreak was underway. So I mean, he's been taking an active part in undermining vaccines, and not just measles, right? I mean, he just muzzled the CDC education campaign on flu vaccines. He wants to revisit the whole childhood vaccine schedule. And, if that's not bad enough, he also wants to, defund food safety, regulations. And that's going to increase things like foodborne illness. He wants raw milk to be available, which is going to increase the prevalence of milk-borne illness. I mean, it's a lot. It feels very overwhelming.
We seem to be in idiocracy.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like sixth grade Andrea, who was like so excited about science, like never could have imagined a world where like the guy you learn about as the figurehead of the modern day anti-vaccine movement is in charge of the health agencies.
Mm. Well, thank you
But
for fighting the good fight.
yes, you are here doing what sixth grade you imagined, and you're doing it well. And this is important. And we're all here learning new information. And we all know now that we definitely do not want to get measles. So that is important.
Yes.
Thank you for that. And thank you for sharing all of this information with us and for all of your other work. You are making a difference. And thank you for that.
Thank you
And
for having me and all the work you're doing as well.
Absolutely. Would love to have you back. And we're going to go ahead and wrap up here. We've kept you all evening, but we are going to move to the hangout here in just a minute. So if you want to stick around and hang out with us longer, we
I
would
got a
love
few
for you
minutes
to.
left in me.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, perfect. Well, we'll move on to that real quick. Don't forget to join us next week, everybody. Same time, same channel. We have Dr. Abby Haffer, who is going to be speaking on unintelligent design, why evolution explains the human body and intelligent design does not. Some other guests we have coming up are Natalia Pasternak, Neil the 604 Atheist, Stephen Novella, Mallory Mackey, and Erica Matthews. So keep on coming back if you want to hang out with us and learn new things and recover from religion. Also, be sure to follow us on social media. It helps other people find us and find our services, and it also helps you stay aware of what's going on. And I am dropping a link to our link tree. We're on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky, and of course, YouTube, where you can find previous recordings of RfRx. And Rob, how else can people get involved?
So let's see what we were. Oh, you want me to talk about volunteering?
Yes.
Okay. So we have learned here that healing can come from helping other people heal themselves. All the services here are provided by volunteers, and we're always in need of more volunteers. And there's all sorts of jobs besides working the more famous helplines. We need people to find, to vet, and then to post good resources. And we mentioned the resource database that we have that helps our clients and also the agents. We need people to host the support groups, to support the online community, also to work IT support. We're always updating our software that helps both the clients access it and the agents use it. So to apply to volunteer, you can fill out the form on our main page. It's on the upper right in the menu. It says volunteer, and it'll open up to a page that gives you all the information, and that is at recoveringfromreligion.org/volunteer. And lastly, I'll say we have a 3-minute video on our main page called RFR What We Do. It's a really good synopsis in only 3 minutes of everything that we took 15 minutes or more in the beginning to tell everyone. And you could use that to refresh your memory about what we do, or send it to someone else who you think might benefit from our services.
Absolutely. And with that, we have a brief announcement before I bring on Dr. Ray. The fabulous Glenda Jordan, Senior Troll Stomper, also has an announcement to share with us. Glenda, what do you have for us?
I am so excited to finally tell everybody we finally have a date for the Big Deal Spring fundraiser. So this May 10th, it's a Saturday. It's the second Saturday in May. We are having our, hopefully we're going to do 2 annuals, we'll see, but our big spring fundraiser. It's going to be hosted on the YouTube channel, The Line. I'm posting the link in the chat. So we've hosted our fundraiser on this YouTube channel before. It's, if you remember it, it's hours of incredible guests. We have such a great time. We are so excited to crush our fundraising goals so that we continue to provide support systems for everybody. Again, May 10th on The Line, May 10th. Yes, the fundraiser was fabulous. It's epic. I can't wait to show everybody. We'll be sure to stay follow us on all of our social media, because we will be posting updates. We're going to be posting the guests that we're going to have on the show, any special giveaways that we're doing. I may or may not be making another painting for it. We'll see. So please feel free to go to our socials, stay up to speed, follow us on Blue Sky, that kind of thing, and we will be sure to update on any new fun information we have about our fundraiser. We are so excited.
I cannot wait. Thank you for sharing that, Glenda. That is super exciting. Okay, and now we're going to make Dr. Ray follow that up with his comments.
All right. But how do you follow Glenda? I don't know. Andrea, thank you so much for coming and doing this. I get sucked down into rabbit holes way too often on the internet. And I'm a really skeptical and I'm pretty science literate, but even I get fooled sometimes. I just want to kick myself. So how can you be so stupid as to think that was they got some real slick ways to draw
Oh
you
yeah.
in.
Oh yeah.
But as we get told every now and then around here, I almost thought Kara was going to say it, but you're doing the Lord's work. And I mean that in a tongue-in-cheek way.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I thought about saying it, but I stopped myself.
Every time I say, oh my God, is like a reflex. I'm like, I feel
yeah.
like I should change that phrase.
I'm a runner as well, but I've never done more than a half marathon. I'm just not quite up to it anymore. But my hat is off to you, an ultra marathoner. I've got another friend of mine
I
that's
have
ultra.
a friend. She's a stage 3C ovarian cancer survivor. She just turned 60. She's the only one of her cancer cohort that is still alive. She had her 20-year anniversary.
Oh, wow.
And she runs 100 milers.
Oh,
And
wow.
I'm like, she's the one that like gets me out of bed in the morning, and yeah, she's who I want to be when I grow up.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, just I was born in 1950, and my family was terrified of polio, of course, and the measles. And when the measles vaccine came out in 1963, it was just a gigantic breath.
Yeah.
Everybody could take a breath, and there were four children in my family, four boys, and my mother was just terrified that one of us was going to get polio or the other one's going to get measles. I mean, this was a terror of sorts
I know.
in 1950s and 60s. And I look at people around today and idiots like Kennedy who just act as if it's no big deal. And I hear people say measles is just a childhood disease, and it
Yeah.
just drives me nuts.
Yeah.
It really does.
Well, a lot of people don't know that Elvis Presley helped lead one of the biggest vaccine campaigns for polio in the 1950s because he got his vaccine on live TV,
On
right?
TV, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
I actually remember that.
It's wild. Yeah.
Yeah.
And and now we have celebrities saying that they're filled with toxic chemicals. So
Right, right. I
it's
was also
really,
glad to hear your approach to working with people, because it's almost identical to the way we train our agents to work with people who call us, or other people who are having concerns. But just listening carefully and use street epistemology. I don't know if you're aware of that terminology, street epistemology, but a lot of our people are pretty well trained in that.
yeah.
Anyway, thanks a lot so much for coming. We appreciate you supporting us and bringing your knowledge to this.
Yeah,
event.
absolutely.